you say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that you say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if you offer the blind for sacrifice, and if you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? And now I pray you, beseech God that he will be gracious unto us. This hath been your means. Will he regard your persons, saith the Lord of hosts? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, tonight as we start into this new section of Malachi, help us to remember through this passage how important it is, the attitude and the actions with which we serve you. And sometimes when things become mundane, it's easy to fall into a rut and just to do things out of obligation, rather than realize that we serve a great God and a mighty God. And people are always watching to see the way in which we treat you and the way in which we serve, because this is definitely a reflection on how much we honor and glorify you. I did this, and I did this. But when you see what he addresses here as we're working through it, it's pretty easy to realize that if you were the one that someone were treating this way, you wouldn't be very happy either. There is an expectation here in verse 6 that Malachi lays out for the argument, and it's a reasonable expectation. He's addressing the priesthood and he's addressing the prophets, but by extension, he is also addressing all of the rest of the nation of Israel. Now, if you think about the priesthood, they are set apart. Set apart has two meanings. You are set apart from one thing, but you are set apart to another thing. And so if you think about how the priesthood is set up, all of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy over and over and over again deal with this. You have the Levites who were set apart not only from the whole rest of the world, but also from the nation of Israel, so that everybody looked at them differently. That was kind of the whole point of what they were supposed to be doing. You are set apart from the nation of Israel and from the whole rest of the world. You're not going to function like normal people do, but you are set apart to God. Now, that was obvious to the nation of Israel in a couple of practical ways. And sometimes we think maybe the Levites were getting cheated, but they had no inheritance. They go into the promised land and they start to settle, and Joshua is dividing up the promised land, and you can point to the map where Gad is and where Reuben is but you can't point to a part of the map and say, well, that's where Levi got to settle, because Levi didn't get to settle. They didn't have any inheritance, and he specifically tells them, I am your inheritance. And so the whole rest of the nation of Israel automatically would have thought of them differently, because you could go to somebody else's land, but you couldn't to the Levites' land. One of the other things, because they didn't have an inheritance, they didn't have a section of land that they were supposed to live in, they were told to live among the people. Don't cluster yourselves on a tribal land. If you're truly going to be a representative of God, everyone else. If folks had problems, then they came to the priests to deal with it. And it's very important how you think about this and how you answer it. Okay, their service was different. They answered to God. God told them very specifically, some of you are going to do this, some of you are going to do this, some of you are going to do this. When you perform these functions, this is what you're going to wear. This is when you're going to take a bath. This is how you're going to take a bath. Some of you are never going to go into the temple. You're going to do this. And some of you are only going to cut firewood. Some of you are going to write the hymns. Some of you are going to play the music. Some of you have to be this old before you're going to do it, and you're going to stop serving when you're this old. And so there were very carefully delineated, and all of it was to make sure that everyone around them knew that the Levites were different. It was an important part of who they are. And because their service was different, they answered to God, and they were meant to be a reflection of him. You didn't just walk up to a priest in the temple and start interacting with them like you would a normal person at the temple. Because most of the time when a lot of them were serving, they were unapproachable. They were wearing their linen ephods, and they were doing their sacrifices and the different things that they were supposed to do. And so when you think about it, there is a reasonable right and expectation of a certain level of respect and service. Because that's the whole reason for being a Levite, right? I mean, everything about your life sets you apart, not just from something, but to something. And so the extending thought here in verse 6 is that every single aspect of your life, there is a reasonable expectation that God deserves a certain level of respect. And in this accountability, he's not getting it. He starts off and says, a son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. The word here, honor, in Hebrew, means to make glorious or to make great. Sometimes it is described as making one numerous or rich. The idea is you are adding to that person. You are abounding that person. So you are making them great in some way, or you are expanding them and making them numerous, or you are adding to their wealth and making them rich. That's what the term means. So if you are honoring someone, there's no area at all where you would hurt that person or detract from that person, because everything about this word means you are adding value to them in some way. Whole point. The word, though, is interesting because it also means to make heavy or weighty. And a lot of times when you think about that, you'd say, well, why would you want to burden somebody? Because that sounds like a strong negative. But think about it this way. I honor someone when they carry weight with me. That's what the word is implying. In other words, I don't ignore them and I don't treat them flippantly because that person carries weight with me. And so if somebody says their name, immediately there's something that happens with my attention and the way I perceive that person because they carry weight with me. The other side of that is, if I honor someone when I make them heavy with respect and glory and dignity. So it's not a burden that they have to carry, but it is something that's very visible to other people when they're watching. And if the Levites are doing what they're supposed to be, then they should have been burdening the Lord with a lot of respect, so that every time someone looked at them, or every time they thought about the Lord, there was a certain attitude and reverence and respect that immediately came to them. It was something that you put on someone else, and it's something that you felt in your own self for them. All right? That's what he's getting at here. And he says, a son does that to a father, and an employee does that to a boss, or a master to a servant. What's interesting is this word can also be used negatively in the Old Testament. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. So I looked up a couple of these. And the most popular negative way in which this is used tells us a great deal about God's thinking. When Pharaoh is being dealt with by the Lord, it says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Or it says, or Pharaoh hardened his heart. It is the exact same Hebrew word as to honor. So in other words, what the Bible is saying is, Pharaoh saw God do something great and magnificent. And he should have responded with honor. He should have felt a certain way about God. He should have put the weight of reverence and respect on God, and he should have felt that in himself. Oh, wait a second. This isn't any of these other heathen gods that we worship. This is Yahweh that we're talking about here. But the negative side of this word is that he actually did the opposite. Instead of looking upon God with respect and reverence, he hardened his heart. In other words, God became a weight to him, not the way he felt about him. Explains a great deal about why more revelation and more revelation and more revelation, and yet we continue to see this hardening of the heart. It's because Pharaoh is disrespecting the Lord. And so you have another big miracle, and in Pharaoh's eyes, he is disrespecting the Lord. That does not deserve my reverence or respect. Until we get all the way down to the last one. And then he lets the people go, but he still hasn't changed his mind about the way he thinks about God. He's just done with the consequences. Think about the two folks that are described here, the two phrases in verse 6. A son honors his father. A son and a father is a natural relationship, right? A father deserves respect from a son. And when you consider all that a father does for a son, then it becomes pretty obvious that they ought to do that. And you say, well, I'm walking through Walmart and I see a lot of sons that don't naturally respect their fathers. That's true. But I didn't say that. I didn't say that they naturally respect their father. I said they know they should naturally respect their father. You see, a son looks at their father and they know that they ought to treat them in a certain way. And if they don't treat their dad in a certain way and they continue to get away with it, next thing you know, you have a brat, right? And that's exactly what God is using Malachi to talk to the nation of Israel about. Hey, wait a second. You know that a son ought to honor his father. But because y'all haven't been honoring me as a father, basically he's saying, y'all are a bunch of brats. That's the statement that he is making here. It's a reasonable expectation of the father, and the son knows that he ought to do it. Okay? And then we have the second one, the master and the slave, or in modern language, the boss and the employee. This is not a natural relationship. Nobody likes to be told what to do, right? But it is a voluntary agreement. Because at some point, the boss said, I'm going to pay you X amount of money if you're going to do this work. And you went, deal. Right? You agreed to it. Now, you might not always like what the boss says, or you might not always like what the boss tells you to do, but you agreed to it. It is a voluntary agreement. And so, an employee observes the orders, and then he works in line with the boss's interests because a request from a superior is an order. That's what the military tells you. You walk up to a private in the military and you say, son, you need to go do such and such. They don't turn around and smart off to you. Well, you know, I'd really like to, but I was going to go play tennis, so until somebody gives me an order, well, listen, a superior officer can ask nicely, or he can say, dude, do it now. I would personally be like to be asked nicely, wouldn't you? But the whole point is, even if you voluntarily submit to this agreement, then you ought to respect the person who is giving the orders because you signed up for it. That's what you asked for. Well, if you think about the relationship of the priests, the nation of Israel are the children of, so who's their father? And so they know that they should respect him as a father, and he has a reasonable expectation to be treated that way. But then the Levites also have a special arrangement with God, because they were told, I'm going to pull you out from the rest of the folks, and this is the special assignment that I'm going to give to you, and this is how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it, and why you're going to do it. And they went, okay, and they put on their linen ephod, and they take their bath when they're supposed to. But then they turn around, and you'll see in the following verses that they don't meet the agreements that were agreed upon. Now you have the word honor in verse 6, and then you also have, and if I be a master, where is my fear? And this word means exactly what you think it does, dread or terror. I looked this word up a little bit too, and I thought it was interesting because one of the first times it's used is in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 2. After the flood, Noah is told that the animals will have a fear and a dread of you. Did Noah run around and whoop every animal to teach them to be scared? No. He left them off of the ark. Now, think about it. They've been floating around for a year. Who's feeding them, watering them, taking care of them? I'm sure he talked to them, probably rubbed some of them, because there wasn't any fear when they were on the ark. They had an excellent relationship. The door opens up, the ramp goes down, all of the animals walk out, and he's expecting probably to always have that same relationship because he took care of them for a year. He watched some of them little ones grow up. And God says, oh yeah, by the way, the animals are going to have a fear and dread of you. And so when Noah walks out and he sees a lion walking by and he tries to walk up, here kitty kitty, and the lion takes off, it's not because Noah mistreated him. It was something that was natural now to all the animals. They see a person and there is a fear and dread of them. And God uses this same word because he says, everyone ought to look at me with the exact same way. When you look around this creation and you see all the incredible things that he made, how do you not have an innate dread and fear of crossing that and going counter to that? As if we're something special that we think that we're going to get away with it. That's the point he's trying to make. If God is master, why isn't it normal for us to fear him? And we ought to function and live as if that were natural protocol in our lives. Oh, I can't just run around here and sin rampantly. I can't just do whatever or say whatever because of who I am accountable to. But he goes on here and he's going to talk about the contempt. O priests that despise my name. And ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? Despise means to have disdain or contempt or scorn for someone. In other words, they're not treated with a natural affection as a father would a son, and they're not given appropriate respect of a boss. Instead, they are looked at with contempt or scorn. And the accusation that he makes here is, you despise my name. Now, if you were to go through Malachi chapter 1 verse 6 and read through chapter 2 verse 9, you would see that in verses 6, 11, and 14, and then chapter 2 verse 2 and 5, 8 times he's going to use that phrase, my name. And every time it refers to God's character and his reputation. So over and over and over again, as we finish out this chapter and start chapter 2, he is addressing the fact of the way they treat God's character and his reputation. That's what he's taking them to task here. You despise my character as if I am a nobody. You treat my reputation with contempt as if I'm not powerful and I'm not going to have anything to say about it. That's the problem. But I want you to notice the arrogance, because they're going to respond the exact same way they did when he said, I have loved you. Here's the second time where they pull out and say, well, how have we? In other words, we talked about this in our introduction. Defend yourself. Come down here and defend yourself on our level. It's kind of like they're asking, how are you worthy of more than what we are doing? Now think about that statement. Can you imagine looking at the God of the universe who has just called you out as priests and by extension the rest of the nation of Israel and said, you are not honoring me with the natural affection that a son would give to a father. And you are not functioning with the agreed upon contract that we have as a boss and an employee. And they look at him and say, how have we not done that? Or in other words, how do you think you are worth more than what we're doing, feeling, giving, whatever? And so the whole rest of the premise of what's going on here is built on this. He's going to start with the offensive actions and attitudes. And he starts in verse 7, talking about how the table of the Lord is contemptible. You offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? There is no virtue, and there is no value in it, and there is no comfort or credit from it. That's what it means to profane his table. In other words, we're not getting anything from it. There's no comfort in coming and offering a sacrifice. And we're not getting any street cred for it. So why is it worthwhile to us? And there's no virtue in it, and there's no value in it if I'm not getting anything out of it. So the natural response to that then is, why would I sacrifice my best lamb over here? Because that seems to be a waste. If you tell me that I have to sacrifice, why don't I bring the blind one? Why don't I bring the sick one? Why don't I bring the lame one? And then I can check off that box. Did you do your morning and evening sacrifice? Whoops, sure did. But since there's no value in it, why am I wasting my best lamb over here? When I can take my best lamb to the governor, and now I get street cred for that. He loves me because I brought him lamb roast. Or I can sell it at the market and I can make some cash. In other words, they are devaluing the things of God, and they are valuing something else above him. Polluted bread, the Hebrew word for bread literally means food. So it had to deal with the table of showbread, and it also had to do with the sacrifices and the peace offerings and the thanksgiving offerings and the grain offerings and the wave offerings. Any of the edible offerings that they brought would have been included here. Deuteronomy 15:21 and Leviticus 22:20, among many others. You don't bring anything lame before the Lord. You don't bring anything bruised before the Lord. In fact, when he told them to pick out their lamb for Passover, they picked out the lamb and they set it aside and they watched it for several days to make sure that it was going to be an acceptable sacrifice. And if it wasn't, then they had time to go ahead and find another lamb. And when they were sure that it was without blemish and that it was the acceptable one, then you started in on the rituals of how and when and exactly what you were going to do with it. But only when you understood that that lamb was a worthy sacrifice to be included in it. And what they're doing here in Malachi is the exact opposite. Since there's no value in it, and since I'm not getting anything from it, I might as well just check it off and move on. The problem is it doesn't have to be done well. It just has to be done. So the people bring their worst because it doesn't cost them much, and they exchange that value elsewhere. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. There should be nothing more valuable in your sight than I am. The priests accept it. Okay, that's a problem. The people bring it, first problem. The priest accepts it, second problem. And then they offer it, third problem. And that's how you normalize evil. When people who are in authority that should have said, you don't come to a holy God and bring him this disgusting thing. Dude, out of here with that. But nobody's holding the line. And so the whole nation of Israel continues to deteriorate. Listen, if these priests were doing it nowadays, they throw out the phrase we've heard before, welcome to the new normal. Like you're just supposed to accept that what you used to do and how things used to be are gone, and so just get used to it. Welcome to the new normal, and it's okay. The new normal says you can bring anything you want to God anytime you want to, in any way that you want to, and he has to accept it. I'm sorry, but that's not the God we serve. And then he reminds them, if you offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? Now, so what he's saying is not that act evil in and of itself? And if you offer the lame and sick, is that act not evil in and of itself? But then, by contrast, he says, offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? You would not do the same thing that you're doing to me to any earthly authority, because they simply would not accept it. And so he's taken the priests out to the woodshed and he's saying, why are you accepting this on behalf of me when you know this is not right? Our offering to God is a reflection of the heart. And that's the root of the problem that he is trying to get to here. So the question that arises, and they're going to deal with through the start of chapter 2, is our worship acceptable to God? Or are we hypocritically going through the motions? Because it doesn't matter if it's acceptable to us. It only matters if it's acceptable to him. And that's why we have this whole section before we even get into the rest of the book. If you don't value him, if you don't respect him, if you don't weigh yourself with his glory, and if you don't put honor and majesty upon him and weight him with it, then all the rest of the things in the book are going to be a problem. Yeah, there's no motivation, because you don't see him as worthy of change. That's the key issue that he's addressing here as we get into the rest of this. We'll save the rest for next week.